Okay, so our final panelist is Pratik Bansali. He has a PhD in mechanical engineering. He thinks taking a stand against any form of discrimination is something that forms basic decency. This stand should encompass all animals, human and non-human, and being a vegan is a mere logical consequence of this stand. He also sees the interconnectedness between all forms of oppression and their links with animals and their rights. Please welcome Pratik Bansali.
Hey, thanks for the nice introduction. Thanks, especially Mamta, Shalin, and Nirva. Before Nirva was speaking, I thought I'm going to start probably a difficult conversation, but she actually looks like already set the foundation and the background for me, specifically when she spoke of a few things, like when she used the word, the doctrine of ahiṃsā. I think that's very important, and I'll elaborate on that. And when she said something like this, when she used the word confusion in the context of Jainism, that was really important to, to mention that. So I'm just going to talk on that, and I'm going to talk about the three jewels of Jainism, which are usually referred to as the Ratnatraya. Before we do that, I just want all of us to take a look at this symbol. This symbol was agreed upon by all sects of Jainism in 1974, which was also the 2500th anniversary of Bhagavan Mahavir. The thing that I want to focus on is the three dots that you see towards the top. Those three dots symbolize the Ratnatraya, the three jewels, which are, again, Samyak Darshan, which means the right belief or right perception. And belief doesn't necessarily mean in the sense of your faith in God or anything like that. It just means your philosophical stand, philosophical belief of whether, let's say, violence is right or not, right? Then the right knowledge, Samyak Gyan, which also means you need to be open to getting and accepting more and more knowledge and newer knowledge and the evolution of all our understanding of the world. And then eventually using these two things, applying those in our day-to-day life, which is what we call conduct, Samyak Charitra, or some people also call it Samyak, right character. The Tattvartha Sutra, which is one of the oldest texts in Jainism, which actually agreed upon by, and it's a consensus among all the Jain sects of its, what do you call it, authenticity, maybe. It also talks about what does Samyak Darshan means. It means the faith in substance. When you look at something, the basic properties, the faith in substance as the substance is. That's something very important, and that's something that I'm going to start building upon. So again, I said that the conversation can sometimes get difficult when we talk about veganism in any religious circles, may it be Jainism or may it be Hinduism or anything. It's because you have a lot of scripture, you have a lot of rituals, and there can be ambiguity, and those ambiguities and rituals can always and are used as justifications for basically causing harm, or at least not abstaining, right? And in the Jain context, some of these examples are like, what did Tirthankars consume, or were they offer kheer, or the abhisheks done? And also people refer to the vigais when we say, okay, milk is something that we are told to abstain from, but it's not an abhaksha, right? So we can have it in small. Of course, we do have scriptural counters to these questions as well. But I just want to get into how is this even, or is this even necessary to, to toil and to make the hard work and find, someone used the word, find excuses and justifications in scriptures. So before I get into that, I just want to state my background a little bit. I come from an Indian family which is still in India. And my father comes from a Jain background, and my mother comes from a Hindu background. And I hope it will get clear towards the end of my presentation why I feel it's important to state that. So again, when text contradict facts, we did speak about it in one of the courses that Nisha Mehta from JVI led, which was again on Beyond Vegetarianism. And I guess Nirva also spoke about one sense, like kind of looking just beyond the concept of one sense, two sense, and three sense beings, right? So Jainism briefly, broadly categorizes beings as two sense. The mobile beings are two sense, which have the taste and touch. 3 cents, 4 cents, and 5 cents. I've written them here. I'm not going to go through all of them. But one example is, let's look at insects, right? Or let's look at the 3 cent beings, ants, for instance. Now, we say some Jain texts, such as I think one of them, which is completely based on how to characterize beings. It characterizes ants as being 3 sense beings who have touch, sense, and touch, smell, and taste, basically. But scientific evidences increasingly show us that they have complex abilities, like the ability to hear or perceive sound, of course, in ways different than we do. So what does that mean? Does that mean, all this doesn't stand, or does that mean, we kind of start finding loopholes and start finding justifications? So that's something that needs to be addressed. We can't say, okay, this is just one perspective, and the other perspective, the scientific perspective, says this, and we can just hold those two beliefs, because then it's going to turn towards a pedagogy where we are just going to talk about religions or talk about philosophies in a structural sense, and then start justifying a lot of other things which may not be scientific. So we need to get into the basics and the intentions behind these characterizations, which is very important. And I personally do like this characterization. I feel they're important. But so for that, we just need to go a little bit into the brief history of Indian philosophy and religion. Something called Shramanic religion is what Jainism can be classified as, along with at least 5 to 6 others, namely Buddhism, Ajivika, Ajnana, and Charvaka. One of these is actually very interesting, Charvaka, which actually is a very atheistic philosophy, which is only evidence-based, which also rejects the concept of soul. But since we are on Jainism, I would like to stick to Shramanic traditions in context of Jainism, and probably a little bit of Buddhism. So these were voluntarily chosen. They rejected Vedas, rituals, and focused on the human efforts, our efforts towards becoming better and building a better society. Also rejected the concept of creator God, and really practiced renunciation in a really practical sense. One important aspect is these religions, especially the Shramanic traditions, they were propagated and they evolved in the form of dialogues, as opposed to some of the Vedic literature. Well, again, you did have a literature, but it wasn't like a very structured, singular perspective. It was an exemplary, basically, symbolism of Anekantvad that we talk about in Jainism. So what does that have to do with Jainism? This caste structure that I have over here, the Vedic or the Varna system has the Brahmins to the Shudras in a hierarchical order, and then the untouchables. The word Dalit was coined most sources by someone called by a very important personality in India called Jyotiba Phule, and who actually worked a lot in my area, in my district. So it's a really deep understanding that he had. So the issue with the scriptures was the Brahmanical scriptures, or who had the control over knowledge. All these scriptures were codified, and more often than not in Sanskrit, which was inaccessible to the masses. And after that, especially when Vardhaman Mahavir came and Gautam Buddha came, they started talking to people, having a dialogue, and started talking about these things in very simple words that people could understand. So the challenge, it did start challenging the command over knowledge, basically. So we had a lot of persecutions. I'm not going to go through all of these historical facts, but I'm just having here so that if someone wants to take a screenshot or later in the recordings, they can refer to them along with the sources. So as thousands of Buddhists were persecuted in that sense, Jain scriptures. So this I found it important to highlight some of these things, where a king described himself as who can obliterate Jains and Jainism. A lot of non-Brahmanical scriptures, like those belonging to Charvaka, were also destroyed. Some instances specifically use animals, where since the use of animals is justified in Rig Veda as for spiritual reasons or for yagyas, a lot of those practices were done to torment Buddhists and Jains who avoided harming animals. This continued even in the 11th century, and there's a lot of literature that I have cited here, and feel free to contact me if you need more of that. And it's important to understand this because it was under these circumstances and it's under these contexts that a lot of people started leaving Buddhism, Jainism. Buddhists tried to spread outside India, Sri Lanka, Bhutan. Jains also, some of them had to run away. Some of them tried to, earlier their stand was not to deal with or not to be dependent on any alms or any favors from kings, because again, kings belonged more often than not to a dominant caste called the Kshatriyas. But in the face of this, they had to accept favors from the kings. Again, towards the 8th century, because a lot of kings like Chandragupta Maurya became Jain, and Ashoka became a Buddhist monk, and Buddhism and Jainism again started spreading. What started happening is other non-violent means, I don't know if I should call them non-violent, but not like physical violent means were used, for instance, by the Shankaracharya in the 8th century, where a lot of people were converted, or at least there was a lot of appropriation. A lot of temples, Buddhist and Jain temples were kind of, I don't want to use the word infiltrated always, because it's much more than that, but so much as even recruitment to Buddhist, the Buddha Sangha of the Buddhists became difficult when they didn't follow, or when they did take orders from the dominant people at that time. And it is under this context that some people started, which some monks found it very important to hold the philosophy together, and started introducing some rituals so that people can follow it and people can understand and practice them in a structured way. And can come together, can organize. So that was the context in which all the scriptures were developed. And later, when we had a wave of European colonization, these intersections where you had a casteist supremacy, and then in addition to that, you had the colonization coming, it assimilated, because there was never a word called Buddhist. And the reason I used the word background initially to describe Jain background and Hindu background was because everything or everyone past the Sindhu River before the Persians came was characterized as, was basically Hindu. So Hindu was a regional term, and it did encompass Jains and Buddhists. But later, especially with colonization, what happened is a lot of kings who already belonged to the dominant school of philosophies, and the European colonists, they interacted with the people through the rulers. And since these rulers belong to the dominant class and dominant caste, that idea was taken to be Hindu, basically. That just became Hindu because in Europe, you had a very structured religion in a lot of places, whereas India didn't have a structured religion, and it was really confusing. So that started becoming documented, and today that's the position even in Indian law. So when you start looking at a lot of Western philosophies today, you see a rampant use of words like Vedas, and even karma theory. It's really different in Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and karma theory has been used a lot to cause a lot of marginalization when it comes to the Brahmanical way of thought. But you again had karma theory, which did exist in Jainism and Buddhism, which did take the suffering approach, which is very important. So understanding this becomes very important in the context of development of scriptures and rituals. And then we need to think of, okay, how do we tackle this situation? It's literally impossible to know what's right, what's not, what's so-called canonical and what's not canonical. So there's something called the basic structure, and so when we look at all the scriptures, their intention is to further the cause of Ahimsa. So let's say if you look at, let's say when I spoke of the ants, right? Ants having 3 senses, or going from the 2 sensed beings to the 5 sensed being, and we saying, hey, don't avoid harm to the 5 sensed being as much as possible. It's not to say that, one is important than the other, but the basic idea was understanding, trying to understand who and what causes suffering. And to minimize suffering, let's say, because plants are characterized as 1 sensed beings, a lot of plants, right? So it's more important to be more considerate to animals and birds who have 5 senses, rather than more important than to consider plants, right? So the idea was to look at suffering and try to minimize suffering. So let's say in the evolution of our understanding of science, which we should under the principle of Samyak Gyan, which we get to know that, okay, these ants now have more than 3 senses. It doesn't mean, what it means is we still stick to the basic idea that the basic doctrine was avoid harm. And this characterization, facts may change because it already, Samyak Gyan already accommodates learning of more knowledge. But we shouldn't basically go and destroy the doctrine of Ahimsa. So again, when it comes to the ants, how many senses? It doesn't matter when it comes to the context of not harming. It's important to just make sure that we don't cause harm to sentient beings, and that's the basic idea behind that. So it's important to look at the scriptures when someone contradicts us or when someone confronts us with scientific facts. It is important to not reject the facts, but also important to understand what's the basic structure and what's the basic doctrine, the doctrine of Ahimsa, like Nirva also put it. And is it really important? The basic structure, very briefly, I'm going to in a minute, I'm going to touch on this. It was developed in Indian Supreme Courts in 1970s, and after that, it has been adopted in a lot of countries. It's been expanded in Australia, it's been expanded in Bangladesh, Uganda, a lot of countries. So what it said is the Indian Constitution has a very basic structure which talks about rejecting untouchability, for instance, which talks about the liberty to life, which also includes compassion for animals. So you can't touch this. So, and the importance of this is, in the US, we had the Roe v. Wade issue. In India, for something like that to happen, I won't say it's impossible, never say never, especially when you have a lot of forces trying to maintain the status quo, but it's really difficult for any parliament even to make a constitutional amendment which bans abortion or which bans access to healthcare, or which discriminates against single mothers. So that's the power of basic structure, and we need to use that in the context of Jainism as well, in the context of any philosophy. So the intention for the characterization was, like I said, is to minimize violence, and that is what we should stick to more and more. So Samyak Jnana, again, the right knowledge. We should seek continuously to accept and understand more and more things. We need to see how the concepts are evolving. The concept of consent, for instance, was not something that was which I guess Mamta also spoke of, was not something that we spoke of a lot in like a few centuries ago, right? But we need to start incorporating these ideas into our day-to-day actions. So when it comes to the so-called Ahimsa dairy, it's important to understand that it's a violation of consent. The idea of ecocentricity, the idea of anti-ableism, when we say, hey, these animals maybe can feel less pain. So is it justified? And these are things that we talk in the modern context. Is it justified only because someone is disabled in a way to not give them the same moral worth? So these ideas form the constituents of Samyak Gyan, and they should be used along with our basic philosophical underpinning of Ahimsa to further and bring our actions, our conduct in alignment with the principle of Ahimsa. So whenever we see that some actions find some support in literature, or let's say even if they don't, but there's ambiguity, the way we should read is we should have a purposive interpretation of all the scriptures, or we should have a purposive interpretation of the doctrine of Ahimsa, that it's not supposed to be exclusive, and it's not supposed to be a structured thing where, hey, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. It's don't cause suffering, and in order to avoid suffering, let's not do this. But if we are confronted with other facts that also cause suffering, we need to realign just to make sure that we are always respecting, and we always hold that doctrine as something that can bring justice and compassion in this world. So I'm not going to talk about a lot of other things where the dairy, harm in dairy, because I think a lot of speakers before me did a fantastic job on that. But I just wanted to bring a kind of like button up the conversation so that we have an understanding of what to look at when we are looking at scriptures, the historical context. When we are talking about any civilization, the context in which the scriptures were developed, instead of just talking about scriptures and trying to fight over scriptures, fight over the two meanings of the scriptures. So that's what I wanted to talk about. I want to leave a little more room for questions. I think I'm done speaking, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions.